Dead men tell no tales, but their ships speak volumes. Welcome to the Cursed Compass, where we explore the darkest maritime mysteries. In the 1960s, archaeologists digging on a desolate coral island off the coast of Western Australia pulled back the sand to find something chilling: a series of shallow, unceremonious mass graves. Forensic analysis of these skeletons reveals a specific, targeted violence. Heavy bladed weapons were driven through skulls and shoulder blades, with enough force to suggest a purposeful slaughter, rather than a natural death at sea. These people were left in the earth in positions that suggest a final, desperate struggle. The discovery forced researchers to ask what could have possibly driven a 17th century community to commit such atrocities on an uninhabited patch of rock. To find the source of this violence, we have to look back to 1629 and track the maiden voyage of the era's most advanced corporate machine. This is a full-scale replica of the Batavia. She was a massive flagship carrying roughly 100,000 silver and gold coins, a massive injection of capital intended to fund the Dutch East India Company's expansion into Indonesia. Below decks, the voyage was defined by friction. Tensions were mounting between the ship's commander, Francisco Pelsart, and a bankrupt apothecary named Jeronimus Cornelisz, a man whose heretical beliefs had already made him a fugitive in the Netherlands. On June 4th, the Batavia slammed into Morning Reef at full speed. The impact was violent enough to wake every passenger on board, and within hours, 40 people had drowned in the churn of the reef. The surviving 300 passengers and crew scrambled onto a smattering of tiny islands nearby. They were completely exposed to the elements, and within days they realized the islands were entirely devoid of fresh water. Commander Pelsart decided the only hope was to row for help. He took 40 men and the ship's only viable longboat on a 3,000-kilometer journey to the nearest Dutch port, leaving the rest of the survivors behind. Pelsart's departure didn't just leave the survivors without a leader, it perfectly isolated a desperate population with a man who was already looking for a reason to kill. Jeronimus Cornelisz moved to take control immediately. He knew the rescue was weeks away at best, and he saw the scarcity of food and water as a tool he could use to seize absolute power. His first move was to confiscate every weapon and every scrap of food recovered from the wreck. By controlling the supplies, he ensured that every person on the island was now entirely dependent on him for survival. To eliminate resistance, he targeted the company's trained soldiers. He ordered a group of them, led by Wiebbe Hayes, to explore a distant island for water, and once they were ashore, he simply rowed away, leaving them to die. With the soldiers out of the way, Cornelisz's reign of terror began in earnest. Over the following months, he and his followers drowned, strangled, and bludgeoned 125 men, women, and children to death. He used psychological coercion to maintain his grip, forcing survivors to publicly execute one another to prove their loyalty, while keeping the most prominent women as hostages to be used by his inner circle. Cornelisz had effectively engineered a totalitarian micro-society. On this tiny strip of sand, calculated cruelty had replaced the rule of law, and his word was the only thing standing between a survivor and the grave. However, Cornelisz had miscalculated. On the distant island where they'd been abandoned, Wiebbe Hayes and his soldiers had actually found a natural spring of fresh water. When refugees from the main island began washing ashore on rafts to tell Hayes about the massacres, the soldiers realized they were no longer just survivors, they were the island's last defense. They used shipwreck debris to fashion pikes and club-like weapons, and stacked jagged coral blocks into chest-high walls. These fortifications were built from the very limestone that made the island so inhospitable. When Cornelisz realized the soldiers were still alive, he launched a series of direct attacks. He needed Hayes's island for its water, but the soldiers were now better fed and better hydrated than his own men. In the initial battle, the disciplined soldiers successfully repelled the mutineers, and even managed to capture Jeronimus Cornelisz himself, holding the ringleader hostage in their coral fort. The remaining mutineers regrouped and returned, with muskets salvaged from the ship. They began a siege that pushed Hayes' defenders to their absolute limit, picking off the soldiers from a distance. This standoff was a desperate war between absolute anarchy and the last remaining remnants of a civilized order trying to hold on to its humanity. At the very height of the siege, a ship appeared on the horizon. Commander Pelsart had made it to the port of Batavia and back, returning on a rescue vessel just as Hayes' men were about to be overrun. A frantic race began through the surf. Both the mutineers and the soldiers launched the boats, knowing that whichever group reached Pelsart first would get to frame the events of the last few months. Hayes' men rowed with everything they had left and reached the ship first. They exposed the mutiny immediately, leading to the capture of the remaining murderers as they attempted to climb aboard. Pelsart's justice was swift. He held an immediate trial on the islands, hanging Cornelisz and his chief henchmen before the rescue ship even left the Aberlosos. 2 other men were marooned on the Australian mainland, never to be heard from again. Before sailing for Indonesia, the crew managed to salvage 10 of the 12 treasure chests from the reef floor. But even this financial recovery couldn't hide the human cost. Only 122 of the original 340 passengers made it to the port of Batavia. The law was restored, but the expedition had been permanently stained by the sheer scale of the bloodbath. Today, the timbers of the Batavia hull sit in a museum as a physical record of that voyage. The dark, water-damaged wood is one of the few pieces of the 17th century fleet still in existence. Next to the ship are tools like this mariner's astrolabe. It represents the height of 17th century mathematical precision, a device used to navigate the globe by the same men who eventually strangled infants to conserve water. The skeletons in the sand and the wreckage in these halls serve as proof of the fragility of order. They show that human morality is a social agreement that can evaporate the moment a population is isolated from the rules of society.